Zoom recording. Okay. Tonight's shiur is Tonight we're going to talk about the parsha of vayayshev, but before we do, we're going to talk a little bit about the topic we're going to talk about tonight is dreams.
Dreams. We're going to talk about dreams.
And Avis, if you could mute until you have a question or comment, okay?
Oh, right.
Thank you. And the Gemara in Brachot has a whole discussion about dreams. It's like 5-6 pages in the Gemara. Very fascinating Gemara at the end of Brachot. But I wanted to take a couple of quotes to frame the whole context, give us a context about how the Talmud, based on Psukim, views the whole concept of dreams. So I wanted to start with the Gemara, which is actually, no, I start with two Psukim that I wanted to show you where they're from. One is from the Torah Bamidbar, Perek Yud Bet, where it says, Shimuna Devarai, where Hashem is speaking to Moshe, to Aaron and Miriam in the episode where Miriam has Tzarat. And he uses this phrase, it says, Hashem Bamara, I love it, Badav, when Hashem speaks to Moshe, he speaks to him through vision, through a normal Navi is through vision, and Bachalom Adaber Ba. That Nevi'im, Hashem speaks to Nevi'im through the medium of dreams. So that's one aspect of dreams that we have to keep in the back mind. However, in the Navi Zechariah, it tells us Tiatrafim Dibru Aven, the oracles spoke nonsense. Kosmim, the diviners, Chazu Shakar, saw falsehood. V'chalomot hashav yidaberu, and the dreamers or the dreams speak nonsense. Okay, so the Gemara, based on that, the Gemara says, quotes Shmuel, when Shmuel would see a not good dream, he would quote the verse, V'chalomot hashav yidaberu. If he saw a dream that had possible negative connotations, he would say, well, dreams are nonsense. But if he would have a good dream, he would say, is it possible that dreams have only a negative connotation? But the verse says, that through dreams I speak to him, God says concerning the prophet. So every dream, at least the way I've always looked at this Gemara, is that every dream can be somewhere on that spectrum, from 0 prophecy to 100% prophecy, and somewhere in between. And it doesn't matter who the dreamer is, but some dreamers obviously probably have a higher probability that they'll be on the prophecy end of the spectrum, and some dreamers probably have a much higher probability they'll be on the nonsense end of the spectrum. So that's one way to frame the whole concept of how the Talmud, how the Torah looks at the concept of dreams. The Gemara, what I mean by prophecy in this context, God speaking to a prophet through the medium of a dream, as opposed to when the prophet is, again, we spoke about Moshe speaking to God panim el panim, face to face. And this verse is specifically contrasting Moshe to every other prophet that says there is some degree of loss of consciousness when God is speaking to a prophet. Whether it's with Avram, says that he falls on his face when God speaks to him, whether it's some of the other prophets, Chazon, Yeshayahu, it's a vision. So the whole concept of prophecy, God speaking to prophets, often occurs through the medium of not necessarily a sleeping dream. They may not be fully asleep, may not be at night, although we have, for example, with Lavan, he comes to him at B'chalom halayla. With Avimelech, it says God comes to Avimelech b'chalom halayla, in a dream at night. So sometimes it is a dream at night. Sometimes it's a deep dream during the day where you're not necessarily sleeping. You may be in a prophecy-like, dream-like trance. So,
what about angels? What about angels?
What about
angels?
What about angels? Again, that's a topic among the Parshanim. Rambam's perspective is like whenever we see angels in the Torah, it means somebody's having a prophetic dream about an angel. That seems to be, Rambam's perspective. Others say no, that angels sometimes do have a visible form. The classic example that's recorded in the Navi is the case of the angel who talks to Manoach's wife, and then ultimately goes up when they bring an offering. The angel goes back up to Shemayim as the Navi describes it, in the ash of the offering, in the fire of the offering. So again, angels and anytime we get a message from God, how we get it, if you go through the books of the Hasidic stories, you'll find rabbis who heard something from their neighbor, the guy, and realized, oh, that was God sending him a message. So is that prophecy, or is that just somebody being alert to the fact that we get heavenly messages from all sorts of different sources? Okay, so I'll leave it at that. I wanted to close with one more thought about the Gemara here. One more thought from the Gemara here, and there's actually two thoughts. One is in yellow, one is in green, both of which are probably, I think, will have a bearing on what we have to talk about today when we get to the parsha. But Rabbi Eliezer says, that all dreams follow the mouth. What does that mean? He means that if you have a dream, you have to get it interpreted. If you don't get it interpreted, it's meaningless. The Saramashkim, when he is talking to Paro, he says, exactly as Yosef said to us, that's exactly what happened. He doesn't use Yosef names, he uses the term that he's using, but he says, as he interpreted for us, that's what happened. So the Gemara is taking this as a proof text to say that dreams follow the interpretation that is given. If the interpretation is only surmised, it doesn't come out through the mouth, it doesn't happen. But Rava says one qualification, the interpretation has to be drawn from the dream itself. It can't be just because you dreamed about something, somebody gives you a totally unrelated message that has nothing to do with the dream. It has to be in the dream. You have to be able to find it in the dream. And as I said, we're going to see where each of these play out in this week's parsha. And finally, we have one other thought that Rabbi Yishmael Bar Nachmani says in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, Ein marin lo la'adam ela mihurhure libo. When a person dreams at night, his dream is determined based on what he is thinking about. It's all based on what's on his mind at the time, and he brings a proof from a verse in Daniel, you, the king, saw what you were thinking about, what was on your mind. That's what you saw in the dream. So again, we have these different parameters, as I said, around dreams. And with that, we now will begin the parsha of Vayayshev. Now, Vayayshev, again, is really the parsha where we switch from Yaakov. We spent the last, basically, Toldot, at least part of Toldot, dealing with Yaakov and Esav. We spent all of Vayetze dealing with Yaakov, all of Vayishlach dealing primarily with Yaakov. Again, his encounter with Esav, but it's the story of Yaakov. Even though now we are told the parsha here now begins with Vayayshev Yaakov Be'eretz Geraviv, which is Pasuk Aleph that I didn't put on the screen, but we start with really Eila Toldot Yaakov. Now the baton has been passed. We're in the next generation, and we're going to find that for the rest of the book of Bereshit, the focal players are going to be the tribes, the 12 sons of Yaakov, although in reality, it's not really all 12, because first and foremost, only 6 of them have even parts where they're mentioned by name. The other 6 never get mentioned by name. And even among those 6, we're going to find 2 primary players, 2 secondary players, and 2 passive players. So, and we'll get into those as we go through. Again, the active players are going to be Yosef and Yehuda going forward. The sort of passive players are going to be Shimon and Levi, who will get involved, and a little bit Reuven, but much more so. And the people who are going to get mentioned and sort of carried along are Binyamin and Reuven a little bit. And the other 6 brothers are not even going to get mentioned by name, except when they go down en masse to Egypt. That's the only other time any of the other brothers are mentioned, the rest of the book of Bereshit. So having said all that, it makes sense when we look in Pasuk Gimel, or we look actually in Pasuk Bet, it immediately introduces us, again, Rabbi, just for you, I highlighted the Yaakov in green, the Israel in blue. So we can see that the Torah here does not use uniquely Yaakov or uniquely Yisrael. It's going to switch back and forth. But really, the focal point of our story here is Yosef. The story begins, Yosef is 17 years old. I think we all are familiar with the story. You know, Yaakov or Yisrael loves Yosef. Not Yaakov loves Yosef, but Yisrael loves Yosef and makes him this ketonet pasim, whatever you want to call it, coat of many colors, whatever we call it. And this causes the brother, vayisneu oto. The brothers had a very poor relationship with Yosef, to the extent that the Torah uses the word vayisneu, they hated him, okay? Now we're going to go through the next section in 2 columns. Column 1 dream, 2 dreams. You'll notice the motif word here is chalom. You'll notice it's mentioned 6 times in the next 4 verses, the root chalom. So Yosef has a dream. We're in verse 5 on this side here. Oops, try again. Vayachalom Yosef chalom. He has a dream and he tells his brothers, and this causes them, vayosifu od snow oto. It causes them to hate him even more. And this is the dream. Vayomar lehem. He tells them the dream. We're all familiar with the dream. But one of the interesting things I want to compare and contrast as we go through all of the dreams that we're going to read about, which we're going to see 6 dreams in today's section, which are basically 3 pairs of dreams that really are going to form the boundaries of Yosef's life. The 2 dreams he has, the 2 dreams he interprets when he's in prison, and then, of course, Paro's dual dreams. But one thing that's very interesting here is that in both of Yosef's dreams, okay, he appears in the dream, but in each of these dreams, he is entirely passive. The players are, the active players or the active things going on in the dream are not Yosef. He is totally passive in the dream. Okay, I want to just keep that in mind because we're going to get to that when we get to the other dreams later on. Okay, we were binding sheaves, and my sheaf got up, and your sheaves bowed down to my sheaf. Okay, now clearly, with the 20/20 hindsight of knowing the whole story, we can understand this as representing the sheaves, the famine, the stalks of wheat that ultimately lead to the brothers going down and bowing to Yosef. But again, the key verb here, and the only verb, by the way, that repeats itself in both of Yosef's dreams is this concept of hishtachavaya, something bowing to something. Now, in the second dream, again, nobody is in the dream, and it's the sun and the moon and 11 stars are bowing to him. So in both of these dreams, there's a passive aspect, there's an active aspect, but it seems as if Yosef, who is doing the dreaming here, is totally passive. Again, as I said, lots of chalom. And now, after the first dream, he tells it to his brothers, and vayomru lo echav. The brothers come back and are you going to be king over us? Are you going to rule over us? And then it says, as a result, they hated him more for his dreams. But interestingly enough, remember what we said at the beginning. Every dream follows the interpretation. Now here, who gives the interpretation? Not necessarily because they intended to give an interpretation, but clearly the brothers are saying, oh, the dream obviously means that you're going to rule over us, even though how can you even think such a thing? And what gives you the pretensions to say that, to dream that? Because again, the brothers are going back to what we talked about, are saying, well, this is Yosef's, what he's thinking about all day. He's thinking about being the ruler, being he wants to be king. And that's what he's dreaming about. Yosef, on the other hand, perhaps by the fact that he takes the pains to reveal this to his brothers, perhaps is of the opinion that, wait, maybe this is a little bit more prophetic than just dreaming about what I'm thinking about during the day. And that's why he is repeating it to his brothers. But it doesn't say that he mentions it to his fathers. But after the second dream, it says, he tells his brothers and his father and his brothers. Now his father gets very upset. And again, so what kind of dream is that? Can I and your mother, you remember his mother's dead. How can I and your mother and your brothers come and bow down to? So and again, somebody's interpreted the dream. Yosef makes sure that the dream gets interpreted as if he knows this concept of, if it doesn't get interpreted, I might just as well not have it. But also this concept, as we're going to see later on, that Yosef is going to tell Paro that the fact that you have the same dream twice, or the dream that has the same portent twice, seems to say something about it being prophetic, although later on he says to Paro that it makes it imminent, that it's going to happen right away. So there are different concepts of this duality of the dream. And the question we have to understand is, are both of these the same dream? Are both of them talking about the same group that's bowing down to him? And the Mefarshim are split on this one. There's one group that says, wait, the sheaves refers to when the brothers go down to Egypt and bow down to him. The other dream seems not necessarily to have been fulfilled with bowing, but it's fulfilled by the fact that Yaakov ultimately does come to Egypt, and Yosef is the one who supports him, so that he is living, quote, under Yosef's rule, even though he may not, because as the father, he doesn't necessarily bow down to him. But again, the concept here seems to be very clear. Also notice that when the brothers interpret the dream, they do not use the word bowing. When Yaakov interprets the dream, he does. He goes back to that same word, mishtachavim, lishtachavot. He uses the same word in interpreting the dream that appears in the dream. Again, we had that at the beginning. The dream has to follow, the interpretation has to be drawn from the dream. It can't be something you made up. So you'll notice a lot of different aspects of dream that the Gemara was talking about seem to play out here. Yosef specifically relating the dream and waiting for it to be interpreted. Why doesn't he tell his father the first one, but he does the second one? Perhaps because the brothers didn't say anything. They ignored the second one. They had enough after the first one. So the fact that it hadn't been interpreted, he now goes to his father and says, hey, here's what I'm dreaming. Okay, now again, the question is, and verse 11 really phrases the question, the brothers become very jealous of him now, not hating him, they jealous of him. V'aviv shamaret hadavar, and his father guarded this thing. Now again, Rashi tells us what does shamaret hadavar mean, that he guarded it, because Yaakov now realized that this was going to happen, that ultimately Yosef was going to be the ruler in some sense, and he's waiting to see, okay, well, how's that going to play out? How's it going to happen? So we know, of course, the aftermath as a result of this. The brothers hate him. The brothers end up selling him. He ends up in Egypt. He ends up getting framed. He ends up in prison in Egypt. And we go to the second dream story. And this one is a little bit longer lead the Torah gives. Oh, one comment. I have to go back before I go on. One thing that is missing from the whole first chapter, this whole first story of dreams and everything, especially if in the light of the fact that it may have been a prophetic dream, or somebody may have felt it was prophetic, there's one thing that's very, very clearly absent. If it's a prophetic dream, what's absent? No mention of Hashem as the sender of the message. Doesn't appear in this. Okay, so let's go to the second set of dreams now. Okay, the second set of dreams, we have the story that introduces him, that there were two people who worked for Paro. One is called the Mashke Melech Mitzrayim, the one who somehow does something associated with Paro's drinking. The other is the Ofeh, the one who has something to do with the baking. Yeah, Paro gets upset at his two officers. Now here, it's interesting. In the first verse, they're called Mashke and Ofeh, and the second verse, they suddenly become officers. Al Sara Mashkim, he's the officer of the drink. Al Sara Ofim, the officer of the baking. He puts them in prison. And the first question we have to go back is, why did they end up in prison? And Rashi, let's go down to Rashi at the bottom here. Rashi gives us a very, very midrashic insight. He says, what was the sin that they committed that ended them up in prison? Zeh, the first one, the one who was involved with the drinking, Nimtza Zavu B'filei Fotirin Shalom. A fly was found in the cup before, when he gave it to Paro to drink, presumably. The Zeh, concerning the baker, Nimtza Tzrori B'gluskin Shalom. There were pebbles, or a pebble, or pebbles in the bread. I mean, somebody didn't do a good job of sifting the flour before it was baked. Okay, so, and then I'm just bringing down that each of these terms, both Pili and Potirin, both refer to cup. So he was presumably the cup bearer. Now, it's interesting because the Parshanim have a different take on that. There are two different schools of thought what their jobs were, and who of them should have been held responsible, and who of them perhaps should have been pardoned. Now, if we take the classic approach that the mashke, the one who was the one involved with the drink, was the one who actually was the cupbearer, the one who gave the drink. He was not the one who stomped the grapes. He didn't have to do that. He just took the cup and gave it to Paro. He was the one who attended Paro by giving him the cup. Probably he also had to drink from it to make sure it wasn't poison, as we find in the case of Nehemiah, where he has that position in the Persian court and has to get specific permission to be able to drink the Geisha wine, because at that point, presumably the Bet Din had already passed some prohibition against that. But the fact is that the classical commentaries seem to apply that the mashke is the one who was actually giving him the drink. The ofer was actually the one who was providing the baskets of bread. He was the one who provided the bread. Even though he's called the baker, he was the one who did that. So the question really is, if we say that each one of these, that the job of the mashke was the one who gave him that, and there was a fly in the cup, he is supposed to be responsible. He's supposed to physically, with his eyes, examine the cup, make sure there's no impurities in it. On the other hand, if he is the one who is stomping the grapes, he would have nothing to do with the fly being in the Paro's cup. Similarly, if the ofer is the one who is actually doing the baking, the sifting the flour and the baking, he would be responsible for there being pebbles in the bread. If he's the one who just cuts the bread and gives it to the king to eat, he would not be responsible. So each of those plays out in terms of when they have their dreams, figuring out who is the one who should be pardoned, who is the one who shouldn't be pardoned. And we'll get to that in a minute, perhaps. Okay, so they end up in prison with Yosef, and they each have, again, we have the same sort of chalom. I didn't highlight all the different words chalom here, but again, vayachalmu chalom shneim, each has their dream. And again, here they're called the mashke and the ofer to the king of Paro, the king of Mitzrayim, who are in prison with Yosef in this prison. Yosef sees in the morning, and he asks them what's doing. They say, well, we've had dreams. We don't have a dream interpreter here in prison. Nobody's opened up a shingle as dream interpreter here yet in prison. And Yosef's answer is a very, very instructive answer here. Vayomer lehem Yosef, Yosef says, Halo lelokim pitronim. God can always find interpretations. Tell it to me. So clearly, Yosef has, perhaps Yosef has understood that once we ascribe dreams to God, everything is on a different level. And that's why he now introduces God. He doesn't say, oh, come on, I'll interpret it for you. He ascribes, he's learned, perhaps while he's been sitting in prison all the time, he's learned, he never said anything about God being involved in these dreams. Maybe that's why my brothers didn't believe it. And now he's acknowledging the fact that God is the one behind the dreams. So just thought. Okay. The Sarah Mashkim tells his dream. And again, I've highlighted in yellow all the words that are in the first person that say that this dream relates to me. The one side, again, I don't know which is which on your screen, but on my right-hand side is the Sarah Mashkim, the butlers. The left is the Sarah Ofim, the bakers. And the words in green that are highlighted are all the words that Yosef is going to pull from the dreams and use in his interpretation, which we'll see as he gives the interpretation. Okay, so the Sarah Mashkim tells Yosef, it was my dream, and my follow me, the grapes were before me. In other words, I'm in the dream, I could see me, and I could see the grapes in the dream. The grapes had three things, etc., etc. And the cup of Paro biyadi was in my hand. So again, he's dreaming, he's in the dream, very clearly in the dream. Unlike with Yosef, where he's very, again, vo'ekach, I took, vo'eschat, I squeezed, vo'etain, I gave. Notice what's happening here. He's not just standing around watching what's going on, like Yosef was in his dreams. He is very, very involved in his dream. He's taking grapes, he's squeezing the grapes, he's giving the cup to Paro to give, to drink. Okay, as opposed to Sarah Ofim, when the baker gives his dream, he says, wait, I was also in my dream, but that's it. You'll notice he said he's now going to be completely past. There were 3 baskets of baked goods on my head, and in the top basket was all the wonderful baked goods that I make for Paro, but the birds ate them from the basket on my head. Okay, again, he is standing there passively while the birds are eating Paro's food, as opposed to the Sarmashkim, who is simply seems from his dream, he's actively doing his job. The Saraophim seems to be actively neglecting his job. So again, notice there's a vast difference in the two dreams in terms of how we look at it. Okay, Yosef, we know the interpretation he gives, but again, I want to just focus on the fact that Yosef, in each of the cases, takes the words directly from the dream to use in the interpretation. He doesn't just say, oh, here's the interpretation, it means 3 days and this is what's going to happen in 3 days. He says, no. The fact that there were 3 branches or 3 clusters of grapes or whatever we translate sarigim is, that means 3 days. It's not that he just says, oh, stam 3 days, it's going to happen. But then he says, in 3 days, what's going to happen is Paro will return you to your job because that's what you were doing in the dream. You're giving the cup into Paro's hand. It's exactly what you were doing in the dream. That's exactly what you're going to be returned to. When he turns to the butler, to the baker, and interprets it, he says, now, he uses again the same phrase, Shlosha Salim. There were 3 baskets, which I forgot to put the green on right here. We have it up here. And again, there are 3 days, but here what's going to happen, the birds are going to eat. Just like the birds ate something in the dream, the birds are going to eat from you, eat something from, eat you up basically when you're after you're hanged for your crime. Again, the Parshanim focus on the fact that there are 2 different outcomes here. Even though in theory, we could have said, well, wait, he's, when we look at it from the way I just looked at it, passive, active, doing nothing, neglecting his job, doing his job, Yosef's interpretation seems to be drawn directly from the dream. Other Parshanim take this entirely and completely differently, and they say that these 2 dreams had absolutely nothing to do with these 2 people involved. These are both prophetic dreams that deal with the Messianic era, and Yosef, and the one is the first one is positive, so Yosef gave him a favorable interpretation. The other one is negative, things that are going to happen in the period leading up to the pangs of birth pangs leading up to the Mashiach. Yosef didn't want to hear that. He gave him a bad interpretation. But again, as I said, if we look at the dreams themselves, we seem to be able to see exactly where Yosef is drawing the dream from, so both in terms of the words, both in terms of the concept, and of course the number 3 being a very, very prominent number in both dreams, and that's exactly what happens. The only thing that I'm going to digress for a minute from the dreams, just for a minute, I remember I so focused by starting by saying, Kim Pitronim. Yosef says God has interpretations. And after he interprets, in between, in the interim, before this, he turns to the second one to get his dream, he adds a few words to the Sarmashkim. He's just told them you're going to be returned to your job. You're going to get your job back. And then he interjects the following. Please, he asks him, please remember me to Paro as you're able to, whatever you find the time, and please get me out of this prison. Yosef now has found a rope, a possible connection to get him out of this prison that he's been sitting in. And then he explains why I want you to get me pardoned. I don't even belong here. I'm not an Egyptian. It's clear. You can tell I'm not Egyptian. I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews. And here also, I didn't do anything wrong that they put me in prison. Okay. Interestingly enough, the Midrash is very, very critical of Yosef for this, even though if you were to ask me and you were to, it's the same as the story we know all the time, that you have to do whatever is humanly possible. We don't rely on a miracle. We try to do our best to get ourselves out of situations we're in. And it clearly seems that this is what Yosef is trying to teach us, that we have an obligation when we are in a dire situation and there's a person who might potentially help us out, that we should solicit their aid, that we shouldn't sit by passive and say, okay, well, I'm in prison, so I'll wait till he thinks about it on his own. I should go and actively solicit him. The reason, good. Thank you. David just mentioned, is the criticism that is directed at Joseph triggered by the fact that there's no mention of God here in this whole plea to the Sarmashkim? He mentions God as the one who's providing the interpretation, but he doesn't say, please, I know maybe God has sent you as a messenger to please help me. Now, perhaps he doesn't want to say that because even though he says God has interpretations, he doesn't know how they've taken it. They've taken it enough, given him enough faith to tell him the dream. But does that mean they believe in God necessarily? We don't know. And maybe he's not really sure of that. Remember, we're in Egypt. There's gods. There's not God. So perhaps Yosef isn't sure that he wants to interject God here. He's already interjected him above, but that's certainly a valid concern. Although, again, among the Parshanim, the criticism seems to be directed at the fact that who is this guy, and does he ever have Paro's ear? Yeah, he may have his cup, but it's not like he's the prime minister or even one of the ministers. He's a nobody in the hierarchy. So why would I suspect him to be able to sway Paro to get me out of prison? Maybe he can mention, oh, there's this Jewish guy in prison who'd like to, but what's that going to do? Paro's like, so what? That's very nice. There's thousands of people in prison. What do I care about him? So perhaps that seems to be a criticism, is that there's no way he was an influential person. He's just getting out of prison. He owes Paro his life basically for getting him out of prison. He certainly can't start pulling favors from Paro. He has no leverage with Paro to even ask for a favor, much less expect it to be granted. And perhaps that's why, as I said, the Parshanim, the Midrashim seem to say that Yosef was really grasping at straws here, rather than putting his faith in God and saying, okay, God's going to get me out of here. And yet, of course,
very critical of the
well, the Torah itself is going to say right at the end of the story, which seems the Torah seems to be saying, that this is not right. Hey, wait a minute. He should have remembered him because he did him this great favor. He interpreted this dream and made him feel good about it. But it's not like Yosef did anything for him. He just told him the news a little bit before it arrived, according to one opinion. According to the opinion that if Yosef hadn't interpreted that way, it wouldn't have happened that way. That's a whole different story. Again, once we put that framework on it, that without the interpretation, it, quote, wouldn't have happened that way, then clearly he should have been grateful to Yosef for the favorable interpretation. No question about it. David Salder, you wanted to say something?
No, I didn't interrupt.
Oh, okay. I thought you had a comment.
The reference to God is what word?
No, there is Elokim in where he mentions Halol Elokim Pitronim, right. But there's no mention.
He's not saying Elokai, he's saying Elokim. So he's just referencing God in general. So
right.
It could mean to the Egyptians that he's getting the interpretation through the Egyptian gods, not through his Jewish gods.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying that's why probably Yosef doesn't want to mention God here. And that's exactly because he's not sure how they've taken that phrase God to mean.
Maybe remember because he didn't feel
right. David was suggesting the fact that it says Zochar and Vayishkacheo. There's two different things that he forgets. Of course, the Medrash says that refers to the 2 years that Yosef has to wait. But Zochar means he didn't remember to say anything about it to Paro because maybe he never had the opportunity. But Vayishkacheo means that he totally forgot the whole thing ever happened, and he was just going about his job happily until his mind is jogged as we get to the third story. Okay, which is actually not until next week's parsha. But because it's so relevant to the dreams here, I wanted to bring this story also. Again, we're familiar with the story. Paro has this dream. He asks all the astrologers for an interpretation. He can't find it. The Saramash Kim now says, oh yeah, I remember that we had this guy in prison and he interpreted our dreams and he was a good interpreter. He did a good job. So in verse 14 of next week's parsha, it says, Vayishlach Paro, Vayikwad Yosef, Paro sends and calls him. And Vayiritzu Minabar, he literally, they rush him. Hey, Paro can't sleep. You got to get there immediately. There's no time to waste here. Vayigalach, but he says, wait a minute, I got to look presentable. Vayichalef similar stuff. He shaves, he haircuts, he showers. He's been in prison for a dozen years here. So clearly he's got to make himself presentable before he goes to the king. And then he comes to Paro. And again, first thing Paro says, I have a dream. Again, Shamati Alech, I've heard about you saying that Tishma Chalom Liftorto. You can hear dreams and interpret them. And first thing Yosef says to Paro again, Biladai. I'm a nobody. I don't have any independent power, but Elokim Yanet Shalom Paro. God should answer Paro and give Paro peace by providing me with the insight to get an interpretation. But clearly it comes from God. Perhaps in the 2 years interim that we had between the end of that part, this story and this story, perhaps Yosef has realized maybe I do need to mention God a little bit more. Perhaps, just a thought. Okay. Again, I wanted to focus again on the same concept here of first person involved. Notice again, Paro is in the dream and he's standing by the riverbank. But again, what is he doing? He's seeing the dream unfold before him. He takes no part in the dream other than as a bystander. Very interesting. The only one in all of these dreams who takes the active role is that Sarah Mashkim, who is doing something in the dream. Everybody else is sitting and watching events unfold before them. Just wanted to point that one out. Okay. We know about the 7 cows, and all the words that I've highlighted in green are words that Yosef is going to use when he interprets the dream back. He's going to say these exact same phrases back to Paro when he interprets the dream. But again, notice in both halves of the dreams, Paro's only involvement is being there and seeing what's going on. As I said, the only first person verbs are ra'iti and hineni omeid and bachalomi. That's it. There's no other first person action happening. And again, we're familiar, of course, with Yosef's dream. I just wanted to show you the words that he uses from the dream to interpret it. And he tells Paro, again, I forgot to put this in blue, another omission here. Again, when he finishes the dream and he says what? He says, this is what I told Paro, Asher Elokim oseh herat Paro. And he has the same thing again, Maher Elokim lasoto. Forgot to finish this up. Here we go, another Elokim, and there's one more, here's one more right at the top. Okay, so a number of times God is Yosef is mentioning God as the one who is showing Paro what's going on. Again, that was clearly missing in both of his interpretations above. Perhaps Yosef realized, I took credit for making the interpretation. That's why I had to suffer a little bit more. So we see that Yosef, perhaps, we see the level, the stages of maturation of Yosef, in his understanding of God's role in the dreams and his need to make sure that he makes that clearer than he's made it perhaps in the past. Clearly, in the case of his brothers, Hashem isn't mentioned. In the case of the 2 other dreams, it's mentioned once at the beginning, but here he is mentioning God at every stage of the message. As a matter of fact, I missed another one here. Here's another one. All these mentions of God to show the fact that he has realized that. So I think if we look at this parsha and all the dreams and how they play out, I think one of the key lessons here is that these dreams and how they play out and become a critical part of Yosef's life are also a critical part of his maturation, of his awareness of what's going on around him, of his awareness perhaps of the prophetic nature of each of these dreams that he's been involved with, and to the extent that later when the brothers come, he now feels almost that this is a prophecy and he has got to take steps to make sure that both of his original dreams are fulfilled to the extent that he is able to fulfill them. And that perhaps, I'm just saying that perhaps is why he puts the brothers through this whole challenge of I don't trust you, you got to bring Binyamin down, and ultimately the whole family comes down. I think the other clear concept that we have to realize through this parsha of the stories of Yosef is, as I said, his path in defining what is important. I mean, I skipped the whole story with him and Potiphar's wife, where again, he invokes the Chatati Lelokim, I would have sinned to God. So we see clearly that throughout his stay in Egypt as the only Jew there, he is trying to maintain his connection back to the family. This is one of the biggest challenges that Jewish people have faced as they leave their family or they are sent into exile, even if they're sent into exile as a group. When we leave the environs of Eretz Yisrael, Yosef has left Eretz Yisrael. He is now challenged by the dominant culture to retain his connection to God, and he has to take steps to make sure that he continues to strengthen it. As I said, every time, if we go through the whole story in greater detail, you'll find that every time he starts to forget a little bit, God sends a little reminder. And I think that's part and parcel of the story of Jewish history, that if we look at Jewish history and we study Jews through the diaspora period, we find that when Jews get too comfortable in a certain country, God sends the Goyim to remind us, you don't belong here. It's generally, I won't say always, but generally you will find that Jewish persecution increases, anti-Semitism increases as Jews become more and more prosperous and more settled in the lands where they have reached. And God is reminding us that the only place that a Jew can ever call home is Eretz Yisrael. So, and I think Yosef wants to remember that, and he does, as we see the end. What's Yosef's final deathbed wish to his brothers is, I got to get home. I've never been home. I haven't never got the chance to get home. I want to go home. Even if it's only my bones, bring me home. So I think that's a very, very powerful lesson of the whole Yosef story. We're going to see it again in Parshat Vayayshev with Yaakov wanting to be brought back, even though he spent the last 17 years of his life in Egypt, also wanted to be brought back. The centrality of Eretz Yisrael, the centrality of Hashem in our lives. And I think that's about it. I'm going to open it up for questions, comments, and feedback at this point. Thank you all and have a great week. So any questions, comments, feedback? Nobody. Quiet out there. Okay.